Well, it's a very special Daily Tea today because we have Kemi Badenoch in the Daily Tea studio marking, I should say celebrating, but marking 100 days in office as the opposition leader, the leader of the Conservative Party. We were there.
We were there on crowned. The day it was announced with all the cheering and whooping.
We
and
knew
this
that
new mood, new dawn has broken, has it not, could have been said at the time.
We knew before it was announced because we could see Robert Jenrick's people near tears in the corner, Mrs. Jenrick not looking happy. And there you were. And 100 days in, how's it feeling?
It feels like how all the former leaders of opposition who I spoke to beforehand told me it would feel. And that is that you have a role which is constitutionally significant, but it doesn't matter what you do, everyone's going to be upset. And you just have to keep ploughing through that. So everybody from William Hague to Tony Abbott, who became Prime Minister in Australia, said that, yes, it's nice when you win, but then after that, people will hate you and there'll be terrible polls and so on. So we're in that phase. And it's actually not as bad. It's not, I would say it's not as bad as they said it would be, but I think they were trying to prepare me for it.
All right. As you mentioned terrible polls, let's just look at some of the latest surveys. So YouGov says by 48% to 26%, Conservative voters say Badenoch does not look like a Prime Minister in waiting. Then we've got Reform, again topping quite a few polls, but let's again look at YouGov. Puts Reform, Nigel Farage's party, on 25%, Labour on 24%, and the Tories on 21%. And then we've got the Telegraph's own community poll. So this is Telegraph readers. What do they think? We asked them, is Kemi Badenoch doing a good job as Tory leader? Yes, 22%. No, 31%. 46% undecided, she needs more time. And then just to cap it off, Thomas Hyde, one of our readers from Ealing, says, now that Kemi is 100 days into her leadership, when does she think she can improve the Conservative Party's woeful position? What's your reaction to those figures?
So we have a long road ahead of us. I think I said this even on the day that I became party leader. We deserve to lose that election. So the public aren't going to be rushing back to Conservatives. What is extraordinary is how quickly Labour has fallen, which has made people start looking elsewhere. And then they see us and they think, well, we just got rid of you lot, so they're looking elsewhere. The time that I have been advised from people who know this is that it takes about 2 years for people to stop being angry. And what I need to do during this period is rebuild trust. So you might have seen the plan, which we talked about. What is our plan? The first plan is to rebuild trust with the public. Because what tends to happen is that when I say we're going to do this, people ask, why should we believe you? And so dealing with that question of why should we believe you this time when previously, you said you would lower immigration and you didn't. You said that you were going to lower taxes. That didn't happen. And having the experience of government, I know why those things didn't happen. And in fact, many of the things that they wanted to see, I was fighting for them in government. Not trying to stop the windfall taxes on energy companies, for example, fighting as business secretary for that. Now look at what Donald Trump is doing in the US. They're having a boom while we've got Ed Miliband, who's doubling down, and Rachel Reeves taxing even more, scrapping the investment allowance. The Telegraph had a really good story about BP struggling in comparison with its competitors. I was the person who was championing conservative values in government, and I need to make sure that people can see that authentic conservatism coming back. But it's not going to be easy, especially when we have competition on the right in a way that we haven't had in a long time.
Isn't that the danger, Ms. Badenoch, that you don't have 2 years? So it does feel like, to me, having followed a lot of opposition leaders, that you start a policy review, you go quite quiet, you make some interventions, but it takes a long time. You've already highlighted one problem with that approach, or possible problem with that approach. You're being attacked from the right, which is unusual for the Conservatives in the UK. It's usually the left that's split, not the right, but now we have the right split. And then a second problem you have is the world of social media and speed.
Yes.
How have you reflected on those two issues? Because many people argue you don't have 2 years. There is no way. By then, the poll lead for Farage could be baked in, and the public just think the momentum is all with him and not with you. So how have you reflected on those things in your 100 days?
So I think that there is an assumption that poll leads get baked in. But I have been in politics for a long enough time to see all sorts of random things happen with polls. I remember when I don't remember, but I know the SDP had 50% of the vote, and they were telling themselves, go to your constituencies and prepare for government. I need to make sure that I'm doing the right thing, and I'm taking all of my party with me. This time last year, what people were reading in the Telegraph was that we were all at each other's throats. That's gone now. There is unity. Before we move forwards, we've got to make sure that everybody is buying into the change. And some of that is difficult. Not everybody is quite ready, but we need to show that this is a Conservative Party under new leadership. And I don't think that I have all the time in the world. I do think that if you're going to build something that's solid, you can't just rush stuff out and hope that it will last. There are many things which I could do and say on social media. And, the thing I see this happen most often with is PMQs. Every day before PMQs, I get 30 different people sending me 30 different questions. You have to absolutely ask this. You've got to nail him on that. And if you don't ask him this, then people are going to think, why aren't you doing that? Most of the time, 29 of those questions will be the wrong thing, because I know what he's going to say. I know that there'll be another opportunity. I know that this is a Westminster bubble story. And actually, I need to talk about what's happening to people out there, what's happening to their jobs, to their livelihoods. And that has to be credible politics, serious politics, not just ranting or saying what we don't like. And one of the things that I'm trying to show is where we got things wrong, we can fix them. So I will come out with policies at the right time. This week, for instance, we've got a borders bill, which is a disastrous piece of legislation by Labour. They're taking us backwards. It speeds up the citizen track for illegal migrants. And we've come out with a policy on indefinite leave to remain, which helps fix some of the problems that have happened because of the large numbers of people in the country. How do we slow down the citizenship track? So that's real thinking, real policy, real work. And you can't just rush out and tweet that. You've got to do the work. You've got to get the research done. And in a few years' time, people will see that we have a very, very solid base. But I don't think that I have 2 years. So every day I try and say something to show how we are being a credible and effective opposition.
We'll get onto the indefinite leave to remain policy that you've put forward, but just because you mentioned PMQs, that came up quite a lot when we asked our listeners and people who watch on YouTube what they've made of the first 100 days. We had a question from John Howard from Birmingham, who made the point, after rightly raising the serious issues of the Chagos Islands fiasco, she then added a supplementary question about eco-nutters. She diluted the impact of the question with a secondary question, thus allowing the PM to obfuscate his reply. And it has been a criticism, and it might be an unfair one because you've only just started doing this. The perception is you are facing an open goal. I mean, this week, for instance, look at the Andrew Gwynn stuff. It's just terrible. And then there's a huge amount of criticism already racking up on the Telegraph website about the appointment of a new health minister to replace Gwynn, who thinks that people can self-identify as llamas and that there shouldn't be any gendered toilets and that women can have penises. I appreciate what you're saying. You're being quite honest about it and saying, look, we're not trying to do this for sound bites and stuff. But the criticism is that you don't just stick to one topic and just hammer him. Maybe you're kind of playing by Queensberry rules, and really, as a self-styled street fighter, you should just take the gloves off. Well,
I think people tend to forget that I do that. So when we had the education bill, I had all 6 questions on that. That's something that's going to be a disaster for years to come, ruining children's education. We have the employment bill, for example, where they're bringing all these foolish rights. It's basically the trade unions are back and back in full force, and they are writing legislation across the board. I used all the questions on that. Last week, the questions were really about Labour's negotiating and showing how they are negotiating in all sorts of different places and making a mess on AstraZeneca, on Chagos, with the oil and gas fields. It was not specifically a question about Chagos because I knew what the Prime Minister was going to say. He was going to say, oh, you haven't had the briefing, and he doesn't have any answers. When someone's going to do that, it's sometimes best to pivot. I was Trade Secretary. I'd seen all the briefings. I know the detail of it. He will happily stand up and lie at the dispatch box. But what I'm trying to show is that he doesn't have answers. I asked him a question about oil and gas several times. he kept talking about Chagos because that's what he prepared for. He prepared for something different. And that in and of itself is exposing the fact that this is a man who is not on top of the detail and yet is supposed to be running the country.
But just as a counter narrative to that, for instance, your former leadership rival, Robert Jenrick, is making hay online, isn't he? He's going out on his social medias. He's had this whole project on trying to take down Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, because of his links to Gerry Adams and the Chagos deal and other things. He's going on GB News and doing things about, the litter situation in Birmingham. He's being quite vocal in his opposition, and he's being quite vicious in his attacks on Labour. And maybe by comparison, you're just playing much more fairly, but it might not suit you or the Tories to do that.
But Rob is doing his job. Every party needs someone who's going to be an attack dog, to use that phrase. That used to be me when I was a minister. But I can't do all of those things, partly because of time. There's all sorts of stuff that's going on that people don't see. We've got local election campaigns. I'm going out, encouraging the troops. I'm meeting our candidates. We have councils that we run. What are their policies? How do we make sure it's all joined up? There's loads of stuff that needs to be done behind the scenes by the leader. So actually, it's quite right that Rob is going out and doing all those things. And I think actually, as a party, we didn't do enough of that. We should be doing more. But the job of opposition is to make sure we're holding the government to account. Pointing out things we don't like can be part of it. But look at the changes that we've got. I called for a national inquiry when Labour wasn't going to do anything. Of course, they won't do exactly what I asked, but they started doing some work on it. They've started a review. We told them
on grooming gangs.
Yes, on rape gangs.
Yeah, let's call them that.
Yes. Same thing with the education bill. I showed at PMQs that they'd made a mess on teachers' pay. We got them to reverse that. That's actually what opposition is. We can tweet and make lots of noise, but if they're not changing anything, then you're not really opposing. And a lot of the work of opposition is not exciting. It's going through legislation line by line. That's what Conservative MPs are doing day after day. Many people don't see that because they're looking at the people who are on Twitter saying, isn't this awful, isn't that terrible? And that's fine. I think that is part of opposition. But who is stopping Labour from completely destroying the country in the places that people aren't looking? What's happening in the select committees? Look at what's happening with the assisted suicide private members bill. It's not party political, but it's Conservatives on that committee who are being effective and trying to stop catastrophic things from happening. That is our job, and we've got to do that. It may not be the most sexy and glamorous stuff, but that is what is going to save young people, employers, and so on.
But doesn't that mean that you're slightly lacking prominence? Because a lot of politics now is social media campaigning. I've seen some of the background briefing material that has been put together about where the Conservatives are going to go over the next 2, 3, 4 years, all the way to the possibility of a next election. And you make very clear in that documentation that prominence on social media really matters. So isn't the danger that you are sacrificing your own prominence to get on with the hard work? Because frankly, in the Commons, because of the size of your party now and the number of MPs you have, you're not going to have much effect. And the PMQs aren't heard by the general public. What they are hearing, two things they're hearing. They're hearing Robert Jenrick a lot, and they're hearing Nigel Farage. And we'll get on to Nigel Farage in a second. But isn't the worry for you that you're lacking the prominence and the cut-through? Because when you were voted in, a lot of our audience who have written into us to ask us about, give us questions for you, have said, as you say, Camilla, the street fighter, the person who kind of is willing to get out there and say what we are thinking. If you sacrifice that prominence, you as leader are weakened.
Well, I don't think I am sacrificing the prominence, but I've got to make sure that I'm doing it on the right issues, not just every single thing that's going on. So last week, very big intervention on indefinite leave to remain. We're going to keep talking about that this week because of the bill that's going through. I've talked about what we did on rape gangs. We haven't stopped our work there. But I am getting out there. But I'm also meeting people in real life. Lots of town halls. Every week I'm traveling all around the country because I've also got to hear what the public have to say. We made a lot of mistakes in government. We can fix them. But that also means having the interface with people, listening to what they've got to say, getting into those businesses, going into the schools, really understanding. And we put all of that on social media, and there will be more. But what I'm not going to do is hold back other MPs and say, wait until I'm doing 1,000 pieces to camera and then you can come in. I want everybody out there doing what they need to. And I don't think that I'm sacrificing prominence. I think I'm demonstrating what our values are. We are a team. We are united. We're working together. And we've got to keep showing that.
If you were at the farmers' protest today, you're on a tractor.
Yes, I was.
And Nigel Farage ends up getting more column inches, is on the front pages photographed, and you're not. Isn't that a problem?
Well, I want to make sure that people can see that I'm doing the work of opposition. And that is why I was at the protest. And I'm here with you because this is something that we had pre-planned. And this is a way of talking to a whole group of people who want to hear what Conservatives have to say. So I can't do every single thing at every single moment, but we are making sure that we're speaking to everyone and each time communicating what our values are. That we need to look at citizenship in this country. Integration is a big deal. We've got to deal with indefinite leave to remain. We need to make sure that when people commit crimes, they go to prison or they're kicked out of our country. We cannot stand for that. We've got to make sure that our children have a future. Whether that is with good education, which you've done on the education bill, or even making sure that businesses are still here. Businesses are leaving. They're leaving because they've got a Labour government and they don't think that they can have profits here. They can't be successful. And what I say to people when they ask that question is that, well, we made mistakes. People voted for something else. Now you have to live with the thing that you vote for. And Labour were not ready for government. They've got 5 years now. They've got 5 years to do a lot of damage. We're going to need to be ready. And the choice for those on the right is going to be between a party that has learned from its mistakes, shown that it's ready, has a credible plan, and another party which hasn't even run a council yet. And that's a gamble. I've got to make sure that we are the credible alternative. And that requires a lot of work right out there in the front of the media, but also a lot of work behind the scenes. Because we didn't do that work behind the scenes when we were in government, not enough of it. And that's why we kept messing up on things like migration. So I've got to do all of those things at the same time. And the way I describe it is it's like conducting an orchestra while you're writing the score and also playing a couple of instruments. It's a very, very tricky thing to balance. And it's still just 100 days. Labour took 13 years to come back. Previously, it was 18 years. Sorry, we took 13 years to come back last time. Labour took 18 years. I'm not going to get that amount of time. We have to do this very quickly. But it's going to need more than 100 days.
You've said that you almost couldn't quite say the name Reform. You said, and the other party, which obviously you mean Reform. Yes, you are able
because
to say
for me, it's a
yes.
verb that means something different.
Right, okay. Let's talk about Reform and Nigel Farage. So today in The Telegraph, we ran a story that former cabinet colleagues of yours, Esther McVey, Sir Brandon Lewis, have said that you should work with Reform for the local elections or face a calamitous series of results, because obviously you're up against the 2020 Boris Johnson high results, so you've got a really, really tough base to build from, if you can build at all. And without some kind of negotiated pact with Reform, what is described as an understanding pact, you're going to be absolutely obliterated in May, and that's just going to add to the thinking that Kemi Badenoch hasn't got it. How do you respond to Esther McVey and Sir Brandon Lewis, who say, come on, Kemi, you need to do something different. Politics has changed.
So I would, first of all, respectfully disagree with both of them, but also remind them of where we were a year ago. The Conservative Party is a broad church. And when we had disagreements, what people saw was disunity. We've now got to a place where we are unified. The idea that you just do something with a whole different bunch of people and it's going to be fine is for the birds. Politics just doesn't work like that. There are many people who vote Conservative who, if they think that we're having mergers or pacts or whatever with Reform, will go elsewhere. And every county is different. We need to campaign on our local record. People get what they vote for. Conservative councils are the best run councils, best value for money. They don't go bankrupt, the way that so many Labour councils do. Once in a while, yes, but not the sort of thing that you see in Birmingham. If people are not voting Conservative because they want to give us a kicking or they want to try their luck with Reform, then we're going to see more and more Labour. But what they do say that is right is that these are going to be extremely difficult local elections. Not just because 4 years ago we were at a high watermark, but because of the results in July 2024. If we had those results now, we would lose all but one council that we control. In fact, I think we might not even lose that council if we repeated the July 2024 results. So we need to compare where we are now from where we were in July 2024 and remind people that when you vote for a local council, you're voting for who you want to run your school, your children's education, to take your bins, look out after your parks, fix your roads. And it's not about giving Conservatives a kicking. This is about who do you want to run your lives locally. And that's a really, really important message that we've got to get out there.
But when you talk about the kind of Conservative coalition, hasn't this been the problem for the start? And it might be why reform is appealing to people on the right. This idea of uniting the one nationers, the people who would look at Robert Jenrick saying that he would definitely leave the ECHR and sort of bring up some sick in their own mouths. It's very hard for you to bring that coalition together. I appreciate you're holding your breath, really, on what policies you announce, and you've done this one immigration one.
That's actually the second immigration one, yes.
And more will
the first
follow.
was a hard cap on visas.
But more will follow. The thing about reform is, for righties, I guess, they know exactly where they stand. It's net zero immigration. It's raising the tax threshold to 20,000. There's no doubt at all that Nigel Farage would want to take more control of the borders. Isn't the problem for the Conservatives that this attempt to sort of keep Liz Truss types on side with David Cameronites has been impossible for years?
Okay, so this is a great question. And what I would say to that is that many of the people who've started supporting reform are doing so because we left them. They haven't left us. We left them. We were constantly talking right and governing left. The party is now under new leadership of someone who talks right and governs right. Doesn't mean that everyone's going to agree with everything I'm saying, but that is how we do things. And a lot of the MPs, whether you call them left wing or One Nation or whatever the label, many of them have been on the same doorsteps or sorts of doorsteps that I have been and have heard this message. They know that things have not gone right. They know that constantly saying we can have more immigration is making us poorer. They know that the net zero plans are not working, something I was saying way back 2018, 2019. And I am taking a lot of people on a journey. We can do this. But if we cannot do this, then I'm afraid there's a big problem for the country because these views are spread all around our country. Our country is not split between left and right. People hold a whole smorgasbord of views, and we're going to need somebody who can bring everyone together. It's about the common ground now. It's no longer just who's on the left, who's on the right. It's about what is common ground, quite often common sense, and that is what I'm pushing for.
You said for the local elections, any type of pact with reform is for the birds. In the longer term, can you foresee any circumstances where you, Kemi Badenoch, could do a pact with Nigel Farage?
No, not me. Nigel Farage has said that he wants to destroy the Conservative Party. So I have been given, something very precious. I am the custodian of an institution that has existed for nigh on 200 years. We have no guaranteed right to exist. There is no guarantee that we will be in government. But I have to look after this thing. I can't just treat it like it's a toy and have pacts and mergers. There are hundreds of thousands of Conservative Party members who've put their trust in me. They have to. And I have to look after all of those people, as well as a lot of our electorate, who even this weekend, you knock on their doors, tell me, if you go into bed with Farage, if you get into bed with Farage, heaven forbid the image, we are done with your party, that we are not doing this. So we could...
Why is that? Why is that, do you think?
Well, because conservatism is not the same as what reform is offering. Reform is offering a pastiche of something that has gone. Many people who are conservatives believe in the institutions of this country. They don't want to see them trashed. They want decency. They want credibility. And also they look at a lot of the manifesto promises that they had, which didn't add up. It's very easy to make promises. But we saw a budget where Liz was actually trying to do something quite minor compared to what was the reform manifesto. and it didn't quite work. So I need to make sure that people understand that we are back to authentic conservative principles, and when they go into the ballot box, they know what they're voting for. If people don't know what they're going to get, then it's confusing. I mean, what you can see is at local council level, different groupings emerge. You know, we see Conservatives in some cases with Reform people supporting, sometimes with Labour when there's an independent group that's running. All sorts of things can happen at local council level, and that's after there's an election, and it's very hard to get a majority to run a council. But if what you're asking me is, will I have some kind of agreement with Nigel Farage before the election? No, because I need to make sure that people understand who we are, what we stand for, that we are credible, that we've got their trust back, and we can deliver a plan that will work.
What about after the election? You're not possibly, both of you, going to stand aside if you could be in some kind of confidence and supply arrangement and let Labour get into power for another 4 years, rather than getting into the same room, knocking some heads together and coming out with something for the right?
So one of the reasons why Conservatives got into difficulties was because the first 5 years we had a coalition government. People talk about 14 years of conservatism. We actually only had a majority for about seven of those years, often tiny, and then COVID and so on. That first 5 years, that's what you get, where you're not quite sure where a government is going.
But Reform and the Tories together in coalition is going to be preferable for people who are of a right-wing persuasion than 4 more years of Labour.
Well, we don't know who these people are who will be Reform MPs. There are only 5 of them. This is not the situation that I need to be talking about. I need to be talking about who Conservatives are, what we're about, authentic principles that people can buy into, like what we're doing on immigration, for example, like what we're doing on the economy, where we are looking at Labour absolutely destroying our inheritance. There's going to be nothing left for our children. You look at what they've done on NI, just been talking to some farmers. That farmers' tax is making so many young farmers decide that it's all too difficult and they can't deal with it. That's what we need to talk about. All of this stuff about who's going to merge with whom and what can parties do, this is inside bubble conversation. We've got to talk about what matters to people out there. What are we going to do about increasing wages? Look at what the US is doing. Look at what Argentina is doing. How are we going to make sure that we're prosperous? What are we going to do about those threats? Iran, China, Russia. That's what we need to be talking about.
I know, but we want answers from you. I mean, just on terms, you're going to ask about immigration, I'm sure. Let me, as you mentioned, our children's inheritance. How about this very direct question from Maria Davis? Will you abolish inheritance tax?
So, as I've said many, many times, when we are announcing policy, we will announce policy. I think that inheritance tax is one of those taxes that we can see lots of people saving, wanting to give something to the next generation and looking like it's all being taken away. I don't like it, but we need to make sure that when we have a manifesto offering, it all works and it's not just promises. There are a lot of people who lose homes that they've worked for all their lives, things that they want to give to their children, and I completely understand that. I'm very sympathetic. But what I'm not going to do is set out tax policy. I can tell you how I feel about a tax, and when the time is right, when we've gone through all of the policy and looked at where we are, then we can start fixing things.
A really quick supplementary question, because I don't think it requires much research or looking back or consultation. Say if you look at Trump last week, an executive order just saying we don't want any transgender athletes in women's sport. You must have already formed an opinion on that.
Yes, no, that's a much easier one, because I was already working on that policy where we were going to clarify that sex means biological sex in the Equality Act. And what we are trying to do is make sure that a man cannot just say, I'm a woman now, let me in. That's not what, it's just not right. It's not fair on girls. It's not fair on many of those women who have lost out in competitions. I think that's a pretty simple thing. And we've got into a mess on this because we have legislation that was written at a time when everybody understood what a man or a woman was, and people are trying to reinterpret it. We have judges who look at these things differently. So the way that judgments are being made now is completely different from the way judgments were being made 20 years ago. How do we fix that? How do we bring people back into that common ground area of common sense?
But you saying you would ban transgender athletes in women's sports if you were Prime Minister?
That's something that I said even when I was a minister. Yeah. That's not new. So what I'm glad of actually is that a lot of the things what I was talking about years ago, and I was getting shouted at for being called a homophobe or a transphobe. Now it's becoming mainstream again, and I think that's right. And what is interesting is that Donald Trump didn't do this the first time he was president. This is not his first presidency. This is a man who has learned from his first time in government and has come back second time with a plan. That's what I want us to do. Labour will never have a plan. They had 14 years in opposition, couldn't think of anything. Reform will be trying out not just first time in government, but first time in government ever with people who've never been in Parliament, never been legislators. I just think that's a situation that's very risky. We have the experience, we acknowledge we made mistakes, and we understand why the public are angry, and we are on a journey to fix that, rebuild trust, and become a credible alternative.
What do you say to those? Rupert Lowe, we interviewed Rupert Lowe last week, and he said Reform are going to be the party of the next government. It seems that you're saying there's absolutely no chance that that can happen. They just don't have the depth. Is that your sort of point of view and what you're saying to voters who may be looking at them and saying, actually, Nigel Farage could be the next Prime Minister? Could he?
I think that this is what people were saying at the last election. And instead of having a small Labour majority, we ended up with a Labour supermajority. I mean, if 100 Labour MPs didn't turn up for work, they would still win the votes. That's how big the majority is. So when I hear people say that, well, yes, they're going to form the next government, I think about the SDP, which wasn't polling at 20-something%. It was polling at 50%. It did not form the next government. We have to look at history. We have to look at precedents. We have to look at fragmentation. And all of this is, it's a probability spectrum. And Rupert Lowe is entitled to say whatever he thinks, but I'm looking at what has happened, what is likely. Let's look at Liberal Democrats, for example. They got about the same number of votes that Reform did, yet they've got 70 MPs and Reform has got 5. Why? This is what the first past the post system throws out. And I think a lot of people are watching Twitter and getting very excited, and then they will be disappointed again when there is another Labour government, maybe even with a supermajority, because the right has split. And that's why I need to make sure we are the credible alternative.
Let's move on to immigration. I think two things that I think have possibly cut through with the audience. As you say, you've made statements on immigration policy and also you've spoken about a smaller state. But let's just start with the first of those, which is immigration. We got a great email in from one of our listeners. He's asked to be kept anonymous, but he's given details of his position. So he's an Italian citizen, registered Conservative, voted for you to be leader. He's been in the UK for 3 years and earns more than £125,000 a year working as a software engineer. He says he came here after Brexit because he believes in Brexit and Britain leaving the European Union. So this is from him directly to you. The news of indefinite leave to remain at 10 years and citizenship at 15 years was horrible to hear. I look forward to becoming a citizen because I have huge respect for this country's culture and values. They are the reason I'm here. If under her, i.e. Kemi Badenoch's proposal, I lost my job after 7 years living in the UK, I would only have 2 months to either find another job or leave the country. I don't think this is fair. I do feel like I am a net contributor. Given, Kemi Badenoch, that a huge number of people who will have the right to apply for indefinite leave to remain are because of your policies in government, the huge immigration we've had into this country between 2021 and 2024.
And not my policies.
Your government.
The Conservative Party.
Your government.
Yes, I wasn't running the government.
You were in the government.
Yes, but as a junior minister, not in the Home Office. And this is one of the things that I really need to make clear. That these policies flow from the leader. Just as if you're working in, Tesco's or Sainsbury's, you're not responsible for every single thing that happens, even when you work there. And there are things that I argued against, which didn't, which still happened. So I'm here to take responsibility for my party's failings, but I don't want people to be confused and think that I was supportive of every single thing that was going on. That's why I can now come out and change things, and we're reversing things. But I think,
but to his point, he's saying I am a net contributor.
Yes.
But what if something calamitous happens to me and I have to take some time out and maybe have some benefits? You've said anyone who has had benefits whilst they are here as a legal immigrant would not be eligible to apply for indefinite leave to remain. But that seems incredibly unfair, doesn't it, as a Conservative, to people who come here and work hard?
So this is a really, really great email, and it's a classic example of how we need to look at policy very carefully and fine-tune the details. We have given a headline policy that has quite a lot of detail under it. But what he's talking about here is the key thing, being a net contributor. Now, being a net contributor is how we can sift between people who are actually a drain on public resources and those who are not. What he is describing is what I call an edge case. So we can look at the policy and see how we can refine it so that this type of person can qualify, but somebody else who obviously loves this country, this type of person who obviously loves this country is contributing, can qualify. We can look at ways to tweak and add caveats, but someone else who does not meet that criteria still shouldn't get that indefinite leave to remain. What has been happening with policy making is that every time there's an example of, well, this sort of person won't get it, we give up and say, well, let's just stop the policy. We can't allow edge cases to define all the policy. We had the same thing with the spousal visa threshold, where we said that you had to have a higher income threshold before you can bring a spouse to the country to help manage legal migration. Lots of people were upset about that. And we know that there will always be cases when there's a policy change of people who lose out. But we have to look at what is right for the greater good. The immigration policies that were in place when I was born are no longer in place. I wouldn't say let's go back to them because some people have lost out on what people in 1980 gained. We've got to do what is right for now, not just what is right for every single individual, what is right for the whole country. And so that's why I think that our ILR policy, as we call it, indefinite leave to remain, is important because citizenship has to mean something. It can't just be whoever comes to the country and wants to be here for a while. And I think that the gentleman who wrote, obviously he voted for me, he must be a fantastic person, is exactly the sort of person that we want. But there are many, many other people who are coming into our country who are not just a drain on resources. This is not just about economics, but are making the country worse. They are hurting people. They don't buy into our culture or our values. The Radu Cabana case, for instance, I think is extraordinary because this was someone whose family had been given asylum. That boy or that man, whatever you want to call him, should have been in love with our country, and he hated it. So we've got to find a way to filter out how people like that get citizenship, get indefinite leave to remain when they have these nihilistic tendencies where they hate the country. And we can't use the best examples of wonderful people and say, well, we don't want them to have any negative experience, so we won't do anything. We are not leaving a good inheritance for our children.
What about the issue of deportation? We've had this extraordinary story on the Telegraph website written by our colleague Charles Hymas about somebody that should have been deported. Let me just get the details up so we can refresh the memory. It's still top of the website because our readers are absolutely incensed. It's an Albanian migrant who should have been deported because he committed crimes and yet was able to argue his right to family life under the European Convention on Human Rights because his son didn't want to eat foreign chicken nuggets.
Yes. This is a completely crazy story. And that sort of person should be deported immediately. But one of the things that I try and highlight is that we've been in the ECHR for a long time. Why are these cases suddenly getting more and more? Something is changing. And it's the judgments are changing. If 20 years ago, if someone had said, my son likes chicken nuggets, or 30 years ago, I want to stay, we're in the European Court of Human Rights, they would not have been allowed to stay. So why are the judges making these decisions? It's because people are changing. The way that they look at things is changing. The way they interpret law is changing, and we have to fix that. If I was sitting in that judge's chair, I wouldn't accept that sort of argument. But someone else sits there and thinks, well, that's fine. Why? Who are the people making the judgments? What do we need to do to make sure that we have a better system, much more robust? Because it doesn't matter who you vote for as Prime Minister. They can't sit in every single case. They can't sit in every single court.
Are the British just paying too much heed to this treaty that is expanded beyond all recognition since it was first signed? I mean, other European countries don't seem to pay any notice at all. You've got Maloney deporting people. You've got Macron deporting people left, right and centre.
They have issues with deportations, but they don't take the soft approach that we have been taking in our court system. That's the sort of thing that I want our policy commissions to look at. We've got to look at who is making the judgments. Why are they changing the way they interpret things? Where can we go in terms of fixing the legislation with the Human Rights Act, which is our domestic legislation? And if we can't fix any of that, then we have to start looking at the ECHR, whether we leave or whatever it is we need to do. But every government has to make sure that it controls its borders. The duty of the government is to the citizens in it, not to everybody else who wants to come and have a go in the UK. That's not right.
I listened to a speech you made last year in Washington, which really laid out your values. And I would encourage everyone to go and actually read it, because I think it is one of the best sort of outlines of who you are and what you believe about
the liberalism
government.
is hack speech, yes.
Yes. And it was and I wrote a column about it. One thing in there is this idea of smaller states. And I think this is an area, certainly speaking to my sources in the government, for example, where they think you're on weak ground. Because it's easy to say smaller state, like you say, and Nigel Farage says. But what are you going to cut?
Okay.
What are you going to stop offering people? That means that you can have a smaller state, but that people still have the services that they are demanding. Rupert Lowe spoke to us and said he wanted to cut the size of the state in terms of its effect on GDP in half. Now, that's an astonishing claim without any policies.
He said reform will create their own version of DOGE,
So
the
he's
government
campaigning.
Efficiency body that is being run by Elon Musk.
Just as you say, Kemi, they're making a lot of noise, and Elon Musk is retweeting things that they're saying on the reform side. But what do you mean by a smaller state when it means people might then be affected and say, I don't want people to take away my services?
Right. So a smaller state is not always about fewer services. So the difference between me and a Reform MP is that I've actually been in government and I've seen it. So I think people who say that they're going to make something more efficient when they've never worked in it before is a little bit, it's a bit pie in the sky. That's what I say, what I mean when I say people have announcements, not plans. We're going to cut the size of the state in half is an announcement. I talk about a smaller state because I've seen where government wastes money. And a lot of it has got nothing to do with public services. It's lots of little wasteful things, endless court cases. I was taken to court so many times as a Secretary of State. We spend money on legal fees. We're giving cash out to all sorts of random community groups that are actually doing things that are hostile to the state or to the government. I'll give you a classic example. These are tiny amounts individually, but the cumulative impact of them is a whole load of waste that can be fixed. There was a band called Kneecap. It's just one tiny example. We're giving music grants to. Why are we giving music grants to bands? Fine, okay. Pro-IRA, anti-British, violent lyrics, they hate the country. And I stopped it. I stopped my department from giving them money. They took us to court. And the court case happened just as the election was going on. Labour has chosen not to fight it. In the same way they've chosen not to fight the eco-nutters, as I call them, who are suing the new oil fields in Scotland. There is so much rubbish that happens in government, so much waste, and quite a lot of it is done while telling the public that we're going to do new things. I use obvious topical examples. Do we need a new football governance bill? Do we need a new regulator? Do we need loads of new inspectors at local government level checking whether people are smoking outside in gardens and so on? That's a new job that's been created. That's NI, and it's happening all across the board. So when I talk about a smaller state, I mean a better state that delivers better services. It's not just cut. These are announcements that others are saying. We have thought about it, and we're still doing the thinking. We're not just going to tell people we're going to do X or Y without showing you how we will do it. That's what you will get with a credible alternative for government.
But don't you therefore need a sort of Trump-style revolution? Liz Truss famously said that even as Prime Minister, she felt she was pulling on the levers of state in one direction, and the civil service blob, as she liked to call it, was pulling the lever back in their direction. Britain has become increasingly ungovernable. Too much has been contracted out and devolved to arm's length bodies, quangos and other non-accountable bodies. And actually anyone who's Prime Minister doesn't have the control they think. This is admittedly one of your chief critics, Dominic Cummings's point. He spoke to the Sunday Times at the weekend and just said, the government, the Prime Minister doesn't have any power at all. What on earth would you do about that?
Do you need a DOGE for here?
Well, I think so. And if you remember in my campaign launch speech, I said that we need to reboot, rewire the state. This is what we have to do. And I'm looking very closely at what they are doing in DOGE, because there are two ways that you can do this. You can try and make services more efficient, or you can just stop doing things, which is what they've done in Argentina, which is the Afuera model, as I call it. I think that's likely to be much more effective. But you have to think through and plan and work out, if we stop this, what's going to happen? Quite often, what happens is people make an announcement, we're going to stop this, and then there's all sorts of knock-on effects, and they panic, and then they put it back, and you realize they don't know what they're doing. The policy commission work, which we're going to be carrying out, is going to do lots of deep thinking about all of this. We have to do something like DOGE, probably won't call it that, but we have to have a revolution on this, and we have to make sure that we get more people back into work, because that fixes a whole bunch of things. It fixes immigration, where there's pressure to bring in lots of people to do jobs that Brits don't necessarily want to do or cannot do because they don't have the skills. But it also means that we're making more money and can support better run public services.
Could I just make sure I heard you correctly? The Conservatives no longer support a new football regulator. Is that right? Is that where you are? Or
it was
your policy to support it, and you put it in place.
I thought, well, no, I was against it in the same way that I was against the additional smoking bans.
But it was your government. Sorry, it's to the public. They don't really maybe see the difference. So are you now saying that there shouldn't be a new football regulator?
The Conservative Party is under new leadership, and all of the things which I thought were bonkers ideas we are not supporting. But we've now got a Labour government with the majority.
Is the football regulator bonkers?
I think that, certainly the banning smoking outside, I don't think is going to work, and what they're doing with the age things. I think a football regulator is going to be a waste of money. When I speak to people in the industry, they don't think it's going to work. So why are we doing it? So I'm opposed to it personally, and the party is looking at how we can improve the bill, because we don't have the numbers in the Commons or even in the Lords to stop it. But these are things which ended up becoming cross-party consensus. But are they actually making things better? People feel that a football regulator will help smaller clubs in towns and so on. That's why they're doing it. So I understand the problem that they're trying to solve. I just don't think a football regulator will do it. And I've always said so.
A couple of quick fire questions, because I know you need to go. John McDougall asks, will you abolish non-crime hate incident recording by the police?
Well, we've had these things for 30 years, and it's another example of stuff that needs to be changed, because people are looking at things in a way they never used to before. So Alison Pearson, who writes for Telegraph, is my constituent. What happened to her should never have happened. I think that we need to look again at non-hate crime incidents, and if we cannot make it work, then we will abolish them. But let's see what the problem they're trying to solve is. I don't see it, but before we rush out, say we're going to scrap something, we will look to make sure that there's no knock-on effect.
Another quick follow-up, because I read before we came into the studio that Andrew Gwynn is now going to be investigated under the non-crime hate incident recording system that the police have in place. Should Andrew Gwynn just resign?
I think he's already been... Oh, you mean I think he's already been sacked?
He's been suspended, and he's given what some people think is a mealy-mouthed apology for his rather inappropriate remarks about constituents, about fellow MPs who are black, about Jews and others.
Yes.
Lots of people are finding the WhatsApp so abhorrent that the argument goes that he should just not represent anyone as an MP anymore and should simply just stand down.
Well, I think, I haven't seen the WhatsApps, but I've read reports of it. I think this is a classic example of Labour hypocrisy. People making comments which they would never let their opponents get away with if they were half as bad. But it's up to his constituents to decide whether they keep him or not. That's the system we have, a recall petition system. But one of the things I'm not going to do is jump on pylons. I saw people do this when we were in government. It's utterly ridiculous quite a lot of the time. He can be dealt with by his party. He can be dealt with by an investigation. But it's not for me to defend. It's not for me to defend him. I'm sure he's a big boy and he can look after himself. But we don't want to see people using that sort of language. I think that's quite wrong. But getting into non-hate crime incidents and so on, is that a way that can be that you can resolve these things? There must be a better way that doesn't waste police time. He's put stupid comments in a WhatsApp group. They're offensive. I'm sure there's a quick, simple way for his party and his constituents to deal with that without wasting police time.
Final big question from, or into a big area, from David Lenton from Chester. How is she, Kemi Badenoch, going to reduce the benefits bill so people have to seek work?
Well, this is, the point I was making earlier. We have to get people back to work. It is one of the things that is making us poorer. And there are too many people, in my view, who don't meet what I think is the threshold for being off sick, who are able to claim that they are off sick. And I think that's one of the areas that we need to look at. Again, I know that we were looking at that in government just before the election. If Labour is serious and want to do some tough stuff there, we will support them. But that's one of the things that I think will be a game changer.
Do you think it's crazy that people are able to be signed off sick for long periods and take benefits for long periods without actually having a face-to-face meeting with anyone? Lots of people aren't seen in person. And I say that speaking personally because my father used to do disability living allowance visits as a GP. And he was saying to me the other day, you see a graph, and Fraser Nelson, our former colleague on the Telegraph, does a lot of work on this. You know, since COVID, they haven't restored face-to-face. How can you make an assessment on somebody's medical fitness to work on Zoom?
It needs to be restored. I don't think it can be done on Zoom. And as with so many things that have gone wrong in the country, we have an idea that's there to protect some people for a short period of time, and then it gets exploited. But no one ever takes things back to where they used to be. We should have face-to-face assessments. Absolutely.
In a year's time, Kemi Badenoch, you come back and see us, you give another interview to the Daily Tea because this has been so tremendously enjoyable. We thank you for your time. Where will you be in the polls versus Keir Starmer and Nigel Farage? And what do you want for the Conservative Party when you look back in a year's time to have achieved in 2025?
I want the Conservative Party to have rebuilt trust with the public. And I think we can only do that by doing the job which they've given us, which is being an effective opposition, holding the government to account, getting them to change and course correct where they're going wrong. We don't have the numbers, but quite often the arguments are powerful enough that we can get the groundswell of public opinion on side, like we did with rape gangs, for example. So in a year's time, I hope that we will be rebuilding trust. I cannot say what the polls will be. Polls go up and down. And actually, I think as a politician, if you spend a lot of time looking at the polls, you'll go crazy. You've got to know your own mind, and I do. You've got to be brave and do the right thing, even when lots of people are shouting and asking you to change course and go elsewhere. I am not a weather vane. I don't just blow whichever way people are blowing. I look at where I'm trying to get to. And where I'm trying to get to is a country that is back to its authentic conservative principles, with a government that knows what it's doing, not just making announcements, but having proper plans that will work.
Kemi Badenoch, thank you very much indeed for your time this afternoon. Thank you to Daily Tears for sending in your questions. If you'd like to respond to what Kemi Badenoch has said in this Daily Tea special interview, then please do get in touch. The email is thedailytea@telegraph.co.uk, or you can contact us via our socials at Daily Tea Podcast. Kamal?
Kemi Badenoch, thank you very much. We'll be back tomorrow, 5 o'clock.